the chat and discussion at the end. But essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to a working paper that I did last year as part of a project that I worked on with Safas van der Berg at Stellenbosch, which was looking at schools in the time of COVID. And I was particularly focused there on the impacts on curriculum and on in the context of learning losses. So I'm sorry you've gone, Margie, because you were a live person. The other day I was talking, and I suddenly thought I wouldn't know if everything had frozen. Would you mind staying on? Thanks. Where was I? Yeah. So I'm going to talk mainly to that and then reflect on some of the developments, subsequent developments to that. So the research questions there were: what is the time lost? What are the implications of lost time for learning losses? Because the two aren't exactly the same thing. What was the curriculum policy response to COVID? And I'll go over that quite quickly. And then in the original report, I make some recommendations, but at this point, I think I'm going to speak a little bit more to what to look for or what to watch in 2021 as a result of the kinds of decisions and things that happened in 2020. So a lot of us will be familiar with the reporting of the days lost in 2020. And as we can see from this table, and the staggered returns, that there was a huge amount of variation. The most time lost was in grade 4 and 5 and 8 and 9, and the least in grade 12 and grade 7, where learners were brought back relatively early. But we did find, just according to the official school timetable, that up to 80 days were lost for some students, and a lot of people say that the matrics or the grade 12s actually got more instructional time in 2020 than they would ordinarily, largely because of the cancelling of the June exams. But this formal calendar obviously didn't translate into the real number of days lost, and there were additional days lost, largely because of the rotational timetabling and a very stringent requirements re social distancing. So 1.5 meter distance and 50% capacity in the school, as well as mask wearing, etc. Some of the most stringent requirements in the world. Then there were also school closures, there were teacher shortages and absences, there was social instability at the time, there were service delivery protests, and also the 2020 year end was supposed to end on the 15th of December, but in fact a lot of schools finished a lot before then, and there was the writing of exams in a lot of schools, which wasn't supposed to happen. So that also eroded teaching and learning days. So what that meant were additional school days lost. So in grade 4, although officially 80 days were lost, one could, with just taking into account the rotations, nothing else, you could estimate that an additional 40 to 60 days were lost. So on average, we're looking at between 39% and 69% school days lost. And what was clear from the research that I did from this was that the more crowded a school, the less space and the less resource, the more days were lost. In other words, these losses of learning days mapped onto existing educational inequalities. And here is just an example, one of the cases that I had of a school and the kinds of things that they had to juggle and deal with the loss of school governing body posts, teacher anxiety, all the rest, which meant that their students were basically in the third term getting 1 day a week of on face-to-face instruction. And of course, the better resourced schools were able to apply to come back early, and that was increasingly the case. Better resourced, more schools were optimizing learning time. But what is this? Oh, okay. So just then to just bring this up to date a little bit in terms of these issues. So social distancing has been reduced to 1 meter, and the 50% rule has been removed. But there's strong union support for rotational timetabling still. And so what you're going to get is the similar unevenness and inequities in 2021. So you do find a lot of schools still doing rotational timetabling, particularly schools that are overcrowded. And in other schools, children are coming back. I think in the draft directions, there was this strong push to just bring all primary school kids back and have rotational timetabling in secondary school, but it is to the sort of direction is to try and bring learners back, but they have to meet particular safety precautions. So, but when these lost days don't translate into learning, the loss of school days doesn't translate directly into the loss of learning days. And so current estimates, whereas we started out with World Bank estimates of 1 day lost, one day of learning lost, the most current estimates are for every day, school day lost, it's 2 days of learning lost. And that's got a lot to do with things like forgetting and losing the habits of learning. And then, of course, in the context of the pandemic, there are a whole lot of psychosocial issues that are also at play, which impacts on learners' learning. But if we look across the literature, the international literature, we find that these learning losses are very uneven, and in South Africa as well. So there are differences certainly along socioeconomic lines, that poorer kids are going to lose more learning than richer kids, but even within those socioeconomic groupings, there being big differences. So at the lower end, depending on how educated parents are in the home or access to education resources there are in the home, there are differences between children coming from lower socioeconomic groups. And in the higher socioeconomic groups, there's a difference between more able kids and kids who struggle. And those who struggle, it's found, and one of the studies was in Germany about how much more time they spend watching TV and on video games, whereas the more able kids or the more high ability kids are doing more schoolwork. So the conclusion from all of this, and there's been lots of stuff on this in the local and the international literature, is that they're great, they're difficult to estimate, and they vary substantially. But we can say in this, there's a sort of developing country average of 54% of time of days were lost, and so we can say in South Africa that for sure a year's worth of learning was lost last year. Well, we can't say for sure, but we can estimate pretty reliably. So what does that mean? What does all of this mean for 2021? Obviously, huge learning backlogs, but very big differences between schools. So I'm sure many of us know schools that went online instantly, children went back, there were, and then other schools where the online possibilities were completely non-existent, and where schooling was very, very disrupted. There are also differences within schools and the grades, not only because of the return, the staggered return of different grades, but also teacher comorbidities and absences, how remote learning or at-home learning rather was managed, etc. And then there'll be differences within the classrooms. And I'll come back to this issue of heterogeneity or differences in ability within classrooms in a bit. So what was / is the curriculum response to all of this? Last year there were 4. The one was to reduce the curriculum content. So it was the revised ATPs. Then there were the fundamentals, and the idea was there to try and cut down, pare down, identify core concepts and contents and subjects. And that was relatively successfully done, and it was coherent, but it was very minimal actually. And a lot of the initial stuff was just reorganizing because they thought, oh, we've just lost term 2, not knowing that we'd actually lost the year. Then there was the suspension and rationalizing of some subjects. So in the SP senior phase, you could suspend 2 or 4 subjects: EMS, technology, social science, and I can't remember the 4th one. And in the foundation phase, there was the integration of life skills and home language. So life skills, the content was taught through home language. So that was buying time. The biggest changes were changes to assessment and a much bigger emphasis on school-based assessment. So those marks counted way more than they would ordinarily, up till grade 12. So grade 12, the school-based assessment proportion remained the same, but up until grade 11, that shifted. And the June exams were cancelled for grade 12 and for all grades who were to write cycle tests, or I can't remember what they call them. And then the other big response was remote learning. And some of this was online, and certainly initially the provinces, their response was all just to suggest a whole lot of online resources. But progressively, there were some interesting television offerings. But remote learning was a big part of the curriculum response. In other words, the whole rotational timetabling model relied on learning happening at home, whether that was online or parents or neighbors or whoever managing that. So there was a whole lot of policy produced at the time. And I go into some detail about the policy in the paper, but I'm actually just going to flip through this because a lot of this is about, you know, last year and what was going on. But it does set the stage for this year. This emphasis on self-directed learning is another thing. But the key thing was that there were huge expectations in the curriculum planning placed on teachers. So these are just a few little excerpts from some of the documents, and you can see that what's required here is a teacher who is very autonomous, highly skilled, can make all of these pedagogical decisions just in time around content selection, about in-person, remote learning, develop diagnostic tests, do formative assessment, and also be constantly communicating and collaborating with teachers from other grades. In other words, highly skilled. The policy had in mind this very highly skilled teacher with high levels of subject knowledge who was actually going to manage the curriculum process at the school level. So this is just kind of a summary which shows what happened. So pre-COVID over here, you have a very highly stipulated annual teaching plan with strong sequence, selection, pacing, strong assessment system, lots of external assessment, particularly in the upper levels, and a focus on getting tests and exams done, and external moderation. In COVID, what you move to is very weak curriculum stipulation and a shift to teacher content selection, a shift to formative assessment, really devolving that to the school, and very little, at least initially, moderation. So a lot of the moderation processes in 2020 were suspended. what you had in the end, and I won't go into the details of it, but at the end of last year, you had a kind of de facto automatic promotion of learners. So what you get then is you got huge inequalities between schools in terms of opportunities to learn, and you got unreliable progression decisions, partly because of this very heavy emphasis on formative assessment and the process of getting learners through. This is in the context of self-directed and remote learning, where there are differences between different homes. And so what you get, or what you are likely to get in 2021 is huge heterogeneity in the classes. And this heterogeneity is within and between classrooms, and it stems not just from the home background factors, but also from devolving all these curriculum and assessment decisions to a very unevenly capacitated system. So what I do in the working paper is I look at the international literature, and a lot of it is grey literature, lots of stuff coming out from sort of the big, multinational NGOs like UNESCO and what's a big, I don't know, anyway. But quite a huge literature and quite a lot of consistency across this literature in terms of what do you need. So what do you need to do in this time? How do you support curriculum recovery and learning gains? And like I said, a lot of consistency. The big emphasis on instructional time, and the thing there is to act quickly. And that's to mitigate the loss of school attachment and further dropouts, but also to address issues like nutrition. I mean, we've had big dramas around that, and the psychological effects of kids being at home alone. And also you need to act quickly because learning losses compound. So the more learning is lost, the more will be lost, especially for those who are educationally disadvantaged. And then there's also the need for acceleration. So once you get going, you need intensive, targeted catch-up strategies. Lengthen the school day, use the holidays, target particular areas. The matric camps actually, although it was private provision and we don't know about the quality, but they were an example of accelerated learning. And I did wonder when I saw the matric results whether that didn't contribute somewhat to what one might have expected, a much bigger drop in the pass rate. Then in terms of instructional content, the recommendations around that are to simplify the curriculum. We did some of that, and to really focus on foundational learning, on early grade reading and maths, because that's where the losses are the most severe. And we all know that that is where learning is most important, because it sets the possibility for any learning that goes on. So you have to learn to read, you have to learn to count and calculate. And then in terms of remote, I'm not going to go into instructional level. I can pick it up, but that's the whole teaching at the right level group. And there was lots of advocacy around their particular approach, which is problematic in conventional schooling systems. But there was a big emphasis on remote solutions, but very particular recommendations. So there's, a big focus on how remote solutions fail for the majority, how they fail to reach hundreds of millions, but then some very positive evidence of low-tech interventions, especially TV and radio, and some really interesting examples from Kenya and from Mexico. The Save the Children Literacy Boost, which sent 10 books home, WhatsApp parents with questions to ask around particular texts, very simple interventions that were focused on recovery. And lots of suggestions around assessment, the need for, in the first instance, cancelling high stakes, big tests, but then to return to them, the need for diagnostic assessment, Sorry, I know I'm moving very fast, but I'm watching my clock here and I don't have much time. And then, of course, the focus on psychosocial needs of learners and how to try and address those at the same time, or at least address those in supporting students' ability to get back to learning. So, yeah, there I draw out some curriculum principles that need thought about, but I'm not going to go into those. And then I'll also make some recommendations. But let me just talk, rather than talking about those recommendations, rather talk a little bit about what are the issues that I think are likely to be big issues in 2021. There hasn't been, and I'm interested to hear the rest of this this session today around programs to support learning recovery and any accelerated opportunities, because there's been no national program of accelerated learning, particularly for reading and maths. Huge lost opportunity. And remember that our learners had over 2 months break between the end of last year and this year. So for a grade 1 transitioning into grade 2, to have that 2-month break really entrenches the losses that occurred in that first year of schooling anyway. I had a look, and I haven't looked in detail, but the kinds of catch-up opportunities in the new ATPs that have been released are diffuse and seemingly inadequate. So in one case, it suggested that 4 weeks are allowed to catch up for the previous year's grade, when we know a whole year is lost. And then there's a lot of sort of fudging of you can use life skills, even though that's been actually reinstated. So it doesn't seem like the curriculum is supporting this, and there are no obvious national programs for accelerated opportunities for catching up the losses in early grade reading and maths. And so that's something to watch. The other thing that was an area of concern in looking at what happened last year was children moving from grade 3 into grade 4, having to switch to English as a first additional language and having had limited exposure in their previous grade. And then I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens with the grade 12s this year. You've got a lot more, and the matric pass rates, to the extent that you know we really are interested or take it as a measure, but there were a lot more students going from grade 10 to grade 11 and grade 11 to grade 12 than would ordinarily have been the case because of the relaxation in the promotion requirements. And so you've got bigger classes. Teachers are teaching a much more heterogeneous classes. That is hugely difficult, and there are massive backlogs in those grades because those, especially grade 10, didn't come back early. And so the way in which that's managed will be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see to what extent remote strategies, that some of which showed promise, I think the Warsaw Matric program was pretty good, are developed in line with this whole catch-up program, but also thinking going forward, should we have a big first additional language radio national program, or a big television, a single big, well-marketed, well-designed remote learning strategy for the country. But I think what we are likely to see, and I mean, I don't, this isn't, and it's through these curriculum processes, a deepening of inequalities. Because once again, I think in 2021, what's happened is that addressing learning losses has been largely devolved to the schools. Schools have very different experiences of COVID last year, and they're going to have to try and address this and juggle balls and try and figure out how to cover the requisite curriculum. And I think that also, yeah, okay, anyway, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ursula. I think you've really set out the situation and the challenge very clearly and started looking at what the consequences are for this year. So thank you very much for that. And I think it leads very nicely into looking at the programs and that response as you had flagged. So on that note, I'm going to invite Henry Benson from the Centre for the Advancement of Science and Mathematics in Education to share around the kind of projects. So welcome, Henry.
Thank you very much for having me. So yeah, Ursula's painted quite a grim picture. And I think we, well, I'll share a little bit about what we're doing, and hopefully, certainly not going to be solving all the problems, so let's not get our hopes up, but certainly, and I think what's encouraging is that maybe some of the recommendations that are coming out of those big international studies, as well as the work that Ursula and the team have been doing, is reflected in some ways in the design of these initiatives. So I think the one thing that I wanted to start off by saying is that if we think about pre-COVID, we had problems, right? So we already had issues around learner progression, and they've just been amplified. I think that's a big one. We've had issues around grade lag, so learning losses and gaps in foundational knowledge. We've obviously had issues around numeracy and literacy foundations. We have challenges around the digital divide and loss of teaching time. So these are all things that we carried with us from a pre-COVID time into 2020. So just to sort of set that in our minds as we think about how COVID really affects us, and we've seen how it's been quite damaging or extremely damaging, and how we go forward. So with that in mind, and really having Ursula painted such a fantastic picture of the reality that we're facing, is what should it be our priorities? And I think this is some of the questions that we asked ourselves and with our partners and other organizations as we were trying to get back into our program delivery, which has historically been, much more sort of considered, with a much more sort of open time window in terms of being able to get into the nitty-gritties of supporting teachers. And now we're thinking about we're going into a schooling environment which is under an enormous amount of pressure to deal with these kind of losses. So is it to get learners back on track? And if so, what grade do we focus on? What subject do we focus on? Skills? These are all some of the things that we have to consider. Or is it school effectiveness? Really around the management of the curriculum or the management of the school as a system, or focusing on teachers' competence. Ursula mentioned, for example, that that a lot of pressure was put on teachers to deal with these curriculum, the curriculum mediation and the mitigation strategies, and how equipped are they to deal with that. And then the third is system efficiencies. So is this an opportunity for us to sort of think about where the system failed and in a time of crisis, and is there an opportunity for us to look at improvements? And should that happen at a district level or a provincial level? What are the opportunities for remote teaching effectively, and digital literacy and connectivity? As we know, these are all things that have really sort of stood in the way of us being able to pivot and respond in this time of crisis. So I'm going to share with you just sort of two things. One, which is a sort of a project which is now started, is kind of just getting traction now, and that really sort of focuses on learning losses and school effectiveness. And then the other just is just to talk a little bit about some work that's happening around building system resilience. So the project, just to give you a sense of its size and shape, and bearing in mind that this is not a system level intervention. So it works at 4 provinces with 100 schools, so really quite a small, sort of tip of the iceberg kind of thing. It has 3 focus areas, and each of those focus areas has a lead in terms of how the program is designed and the support given to the implementing partners. There are 4 implementing organizations, so 1 in each of the provinces. There is national coordination of the initiative, and a deliberate focus on collaboration and learning, actually, from the different partners to see how we can also share. And of course, the funder in this particular case is very interested in sharing these lessons. So, and of course, there is a monitoring and evaluation component, and I think Benita will reflect on that in her slot. So just in terms of the focus, so we, when I say we as a collective, opted to focus on the senior phase. So some of that is kind of organizational. It also, some of its legacy issues around work that had previously been done with a particular cohort of schools, for example, a particular focus area for this funder. So the senior phase. But the other sort of rationale there is that historically we've seen significant lags and losses in the senior phase, in this transition point between primary and high school. Significant, and I think some of the literature points to in extreme cases, 4 grade levels, three to 4 grade levels lag in the senior phase, particularly in mathematics and of course literacy. And also it's an often ignored phase, what we found in implementing projects. That often there's a focus on a very real and necessary focus on foundational learning. And of course, we know that the system is preoccupied with the FET and in particular grade 12. So the senior phase is particularly is often ignored. And of course, we know it's a transition point. And I think within the context of COVID, imagining that learners have not been at school for a significant part of the end of their primary schooling and now having to transition not only into a new phase of their learning, but also a new schooling environment. And then the project focuses in particular on maths and English. It's obviously limitations on resources, so we can't do everything. And really the reasoning here is that we have an opportunity to then work with a combination of, in mathematics, concept-rich, a concept-rich subject that has these kind of vertical dependencies. So things build on each other through the grades. And then English, which really is an opportunity to leverage off a skills-rich subject, which has potential to improve other content-rich subjects, which are mediated through language. So that's really just the rationale for the focus there. So this is the project IMFUNDO PHAMBILI, a brief overview. So it's designed around 3 pillars. One is to look at school management. The other is curriculum and teaching. And then the third is wellness or psychosocial support, as it's often referred to. The school management support looks at supporting the management team of the school, so obviously the principal and also the curriculum heads for the phase in which we're interested in, the subjects, around curriculum management and also implementation of health protocols. So important that this was a decision made to make sure that that side of things is well run. The kind of components there are effective timetabling. So one of the there's a tool that's being made available in addition to what is available through the system, SAMs, etc. But a flexible tool that enables for more flexible timetabling. That is that enables the school management to look at its time allocations, its resource allocations, and see if it can meet at least some of those targets, and then also look at all the rotational components and all the other elements of the timetabling. The next is resource management, and of course curriculum monitoring, and then support for using technology. So what we have found is that there are major barriers to using technology, and often simple technologies, which could be leveraged in this kind of context. Looking at the teachers, so here again, we said, so support for the senior phase maths and English, English first additional language teachers. And here we are looking at identifying gaps. I think Ursula mentioned the kind of challenge that teachers may face dealing with diagnostics. So they are actually really complicated to develop, and if you want them to be really effective. So support for developing those kinds of assessments and the skills and the capacity to use and develop those and use them on an ongoing basis. in order to identify these kind of critical gaps, bringing teachers together to work together through PLCs in a way to sort of build this kind of resilience with teachers working together. Of course, support for implementing these annual teaching plans and addressing fundamentals. The resource component really sort of focuses on providing some print resources and also these kind of low technology solutions like television, access to television. Not that we will provide it, but it's certainly encouraging teachers to build a program of support around what is available. And the Wars and Matrix obviously is one of those, but there is also a program which is I think in the offering, which is a more GET focused program, and I think it has also been running. So really this kind of opportunity to make sure that teachers are resourcing learners so that they are able to continue learning beyond the school environment. And that's really sort of around this idea of mitigating disruption. With the knowledge that that possibly we will face another round of disruption. The next component looks at the school community, and it's offering psychosocial support to the school community. And this really is around educator wellness workshops, teacher support groups and telephonic counseling, a psychosocial referral support, so connecting teachers and the school communities into other networks of NGOs, networks of support that they can tap into, and then skills for teachers to support learners, to help them to identify, to help them to be able to provide some level of wellness support or psychosocial support, whether this be around a particular kind of psychological trauma, or also just helping to put a particular focus on learning skills, which is one component of it. The delivery mode for the project is that it's a blended small groups / virtual workshops. So the context for many of the schools is not a well-resourced context. So the idea is that teachers get brought together, connectivity is facilitated, these are small groups, COVID protocols are adhered to, and also a layer of opportunity for teachers to connect into, or principals or other beneficiaries in the program to connect into these activities virtually. We've had some activities already, and this modality seems to be working quite well. And then also the face-to-face activities matched with an asynchronous learning management system instance. So wherever there's an opportunity for teachers to come together, whether it be through a PLC or a workshop or a coaching session, that content that is delivered there is also replicated on an LMS, so that if you miss that opportunity, you can always catch it in an asynchronous way. The schools are divided into clusters, so they operate in small geographic clusters, and there's a coaching approach to it, which is sort of in school or virtual coaching. And we really have to be flexible, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. And then leveraging accessible communication technologies. What we have seen through 2020 is that there have been remarkable achievements through the use of WhatsApp, voice notes, and other kinds of simple technologies. And so really exposing teachers in the schools to how best to leverage these kinds of technologies, rather than necessarily going for a Rolls-Royce bells and whistles solution, but actually just to try and leverage what they have access to. Other key things about the project is that it's integrated and aligned to district programs. So it's supporting both what the district is doing and also trying to have the district inform the program as it goes. There's intentional and planned collaboration between the implementers and the leads. So collaboration is really a key component of it. And there really is a flexibility guarantee. What we know is that it's an uncertain time. And so the idea was that we make sure that the program is as flexible as possible. I've mentioned some examples of that, for example, with the parallel online versus face-to-face kind of instance. So that's the kind of the project, and this is my last slide, last few slides, which just talks to the other initiative, which is not really a project, but it's really an effort to support the Provincial Department of Education through a civil society support group that is working alongside some of the key decision makers in the province to align their efforts across directorates, for example, where we've seen often directorates working in silos, an attempt to reduce duplication of effort across districts. We often see activities that are replicated in district after district after district, when in fact these things could be done in a much more effective and efficient way. Also to offer guidance on different delivery modalities. What are the technology levers that we can tap into, and what are the priorities that the Provincial Department of Education could focus on? And then also building capacity and connecting that layer of decision makers to resources. The last thing I wanted to say is this is a picture from this time last year and now, so 2020. A picture was taken, these two pictures were taken on this very same day following a workshop with a group of teachers. So I think as I put it into the slide, I thought, well, the world has changed, right? That's what it looks like to me. The world has changed very much. But then I thought, hold on, is this more of the same? So we might be wearing masks, we might be a little bit more distant, but are we just going to do more of the same? And I think that's the cautionary note. And that's where I'd like to end, is that as we go into designing new programs and responding and building on the evidence as far as possible, that we really try to build back better. And I think that was kind of the mantra that came out of 2020. And can we really do that? Rather than slip easily back into how we were, just with a different superficial face on things, or can we really genuinely build that better? Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Very interesting around both the overarching approaches and then an example of an actual program. Hone, before we move on, there just a couple of questions that have been posted that I want to pick up on before Benita responds. The first one was around if you could share who the funder of this program is. And then secondly, just around the quintiles of the schools and the distribution of them, sort of which schools exactly are being targeted on it. So if you can do, answer those two first, then we can, then there are two other questions.
Sure. So this is funded by the Xenix Foundation, and the quintiles that we're focusing on. So in the KZN province, where KASMI is the implementing partner, these are all quintile 1 to at most 3 schools. So we wouldn't have any quintile 4 or 5 schools in this particular grouping. It may differ slightly in the other provinces. Okay.
Then there's also a question around how, what the approach is to monitoring learner performance in particular, and secondly also around being able to, in particular for this monitoring and evaluation CoP, is around the theory of change of what's in terms of the design of the program. But I think that also really speaks to your last part around, how can we do better, and whether that's been integrated into the theory of change in the program, or is that really something that as a community of practice is something that we should be engaging in to a much larger extent?
Thanks, yes. So I would say the one thing to note about this particular program is that it's unusual in that there obviously is a theory of change, but it's unusual that it's a very short-term project. It's designed to be an intermediary kind of project that addresses a crisis, and really it is focusing on a teacher, so on the S&T side of things, building that competence, and if that competence is there around time management, resource allocation, teachers at least being equipped to interpret and in some ways address the curriculum challenges, that we will see a kind of a mitigation of learning losses going into maybe the next year. So it's kind of a solving a short-term, a problem that we're immediately faced with.
Okay. And monitoring, around monitoring and sort of assessing learners in the program, and approaches and tools to that?
Yeah, so so the assessment, so built into the curriculum, the teacher support is the use of encouraging teachers to use formative assessments, particularly early on in the program, to support them to identify those gaps. The schools, of course, will be using all the usual tools that they use to monitor and monitor learner progress. There is an evaluation component to this project, and Benita is going to talk about that. So there will be some learner data collection around that in the evaluation of it. I think there was one other question I was just looking. Oh, in terms of the functionality, or there seem to be a lot of questions actually now that I scroll through the chat. Sorry. But maybe just to pick up on that functionality. Yeah. So one of the things that we have done with the program implementation is we kickstarted with a school readiness assessment. So in fact, the schools were not automatically included. So it was a self-selection to some extent. The districts were asked to identify schools that they felt would benefit in particular. And then schools were invited to an information session. Some of it was sort of blended virtual. It was an interesting experience. And then those schools were invited to then submit a motivation or an application to join the program if they felt that they would benefit having presented what the program was about. And then from there, a selection was done. And then the next step was to actually identify some of these fundamental, just to determine the lay of the land in terms of readiness to actually receive the kind of support that the program is offering. And then there is a deeper dive level of needs analysis, which is happening now through our teacher onboarding process, where we're actually looking into specific curriculum needs. So engaging with the teachers now, starting to talk to them in smaller groups and really sort of deep dive into their curriculum needs.
Great, thank you. I think there was a question from Fatima, which is not really directed only at you, Henry, but I think it's something for all of us to think about, which is that, you know, looking at these sort of catch-up plans and what we're doing, is it possible in a program to catch up not only the learning losses as a result of last year and COVID-19, but also the systemic losses that in the grades? And I think that's a really important thing to look at in a much longer and broader term. So I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that's kind of why that was my sort of cautionary note at the end of the presentation, was to say we can do this a little bit now, and we kind of really just sort of stomping on a fire. But actually underneath that, we have this much bigger issue. And so just to go forward and try to sort of deal with this kind of immediate urgency is not really helping us, because we know that there are going to be disruptions in the future, whether it be another COVID or it could be something else. How are we gearing the system up to be more resilient in the face of disruption? And that really means that we need to search a bit deeper and look a bit harder at ourselves. And I think that's one thing that it's done for the NGO community, working in education, is that there's a tendency to kind of like, oh, well, we're just on a treadmill and we kind of keep doing these projects over and over again. But, you know, to really sort of start thinking about, do we weave into all our programs at least some criticism of ourselves, a critique that says, what is this doing to improve the system? How is this systemically, whether it be a system at a school level or even at a district level or a provincial level, but to look at it more holistically and say, what can we do? Really sort of embedding better practices in the system. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much for both the presentation and the discussion and the responses, and thank you everyone for posting some of the questions and comments in there. At this point, we want to move on to really be able to look at you know, the program support through monitoring and evaluation, and in terms of the responding to learning backlogs and to the curriculum recovery. And so going to hand over to Benita Williams from Benita Williams Evaluation to be able to provide input on that. Thanks, Benita.
Good morning, colleagues. So nice to have these meetings without having to drive to Joburg. I mean, I still miss the face-to-face, but it's kind of nice to just sit at my desk and participate in these meetings. Okay, so Hendrik spoke a little bit about the IMFUNDO PHAMBILI program. and I would like to take the discussion back to monitoring and evaluation, since that's the purpose of the CoP. Now, Ursula started with a really nice overview of what do we know about learning losses, curriculum recovery needs, etc., etc. And I want to place that within a framework that we've got the National Evaluation Policy Framework, which is set up by the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation, was slightly updated in 2019. But what is useful from the framework is it defines different kinds of evaluation, right? So you've got an economic evaluation where you look at how efficient, how cost effective is an initiative. You'll do an impact evaluation where you look at what kind of changes were caused by the initiative.
I'm not sure if we've lost Benita or if I've been lost on the connection.
She's frozen. She's
okay.
Frozen, Margie.
Okay, just one moment. Let's try and get her back on. I think probably just the connection. One moment. Okay.
Yeah, Maggie, she's fallen off the meeting completely now. So
okay.
I'm not, you want to maybe give her 2 minutes to try and reconnect or what?
Yes.
Oh, she's reconnecting. She said she's reconnecting.
Okay,
cool.
great.
I'd also suggest while she's presenting, she keeps her video off. You don't need to see her video while she's
You're
presenting.
right. Sorry.
No problem. Right.
I
Benita,
am having I'm having this whole conversation with myself before I realized that I'm not live anymore. Any case, so diagnostic evaluation is a piece of preparatory research that helps us to understand the problem. It helps us.
Benita, you're not sharing your screen.
Okay. It allows you to get a sense of what's happening, what should be taken into account when you do your intervention design. It's also quite useful to use as a framework when you need to design an evaluation of a specific intervention, because you assume that there was a problem and intervention was then designed to address the problem. And then what does the solution look like? You can start using the same research to identify that. Okay, so the school effectiveness program design, what's a theory of change? There's a general theory of change, but like Endre mentioned, it's a really short-term program, and actually things are evolving all the time. It's not like a program that you set up a theory of change and it stays stable over a full year. For all we know, schools might be closed again next week or in 3 months' time, which means that the plans that you had to intervene in a school might all fly out of the window. But okay, so this is a school effectiveness program. So it focuses not on the accelerated learning, let's do a catch-up program with the learners. It's like, how do we help SMTs to do effective timetabling, resource management, curriculum monitoring, and support for using the technology? And how do we help teachers to identify gaps? How do we help them to assess? How do we help them? And how do we help them to problem solve, basically? So that's theory of change that we can take into account. Now, there are very many different possibilities for evaluating, right? I hope you can still hear me.
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay. So Henry spoke about they're at the moment talking to educators, trying to figure out what are their specific needs. Now that would fall under a baseline diagnostic kind of work, and it doesn't really matter who does that work, if it's the organizations themselves or the external evaluation company, but you need to get some sense of what schools are looking like when you start your interventions? You might draw on administrative data, you might draw on performance data, you might do interviews to get a sense of what is the need, what are the needs at baseline. Process evaluation, you might want to review your monitoring data, you would want to check if people are attending, you want to check whether any administrative data that tells you something about the schools, you might want to do some feedback surveys just to get a sense of, is this program being implemented as designed and does it meet needs? You can also do a collaboration evaluation. So Hendra mentioned that this is quite an ambitious program. There's 4 provinces, many implementers, different districts involved, and everybody's required to come to the party and collaborate. And I think this year, suddenly we are forced to collaborate in ways that we haven't been collaborating before. So it might be useful to focus a little bit on how does collaboration work? Is the collaboration working? What are the factors that are contributing to it? Then obviously you are interested in the outcome evaluation. So what have been achieved? You might be interested in the psychosocial aspects. So either the psychosocial impact, do teachers feel more supported, or what are the actual needs? It's a nice additional question you can ask, particularly because we know psychosocial support is quite important. And then you could also do what we call a developmental evaluation. I think in one of the previous CoP meetings, Donna Podums presented on developmental evaluation. Now, Hendra mentioned that with this program, there's a flexibility guarantee, but that means that that means that your evaluation might also evolve continuously to address the program. So those are options that you could consider. You do not need to do everything. You could do some of it, and it depends really on what your needs are if you are implementing a program. So I've outlined some evaluation questions. For the baseline diagnostic, what are the needs? How are learners performing? What does teacher and learner attendance look like? What level of curriculum coverage was achieved? How are schools dealing with the learning losses? Those are the kinds of questions that I would ask when you want to do some baseline information. Now, this information is being collected by a variety of implementers in the program. So that data can be consolidated into a baseline report that you can then use to refer to once you want to do an outcome evaluation. Process evaluation questions: is the program reaching the anticipated number of schools, teacher, SMT members? At what level are they participating? Are they coming to one session? Are they more active in the WhatsApp meetings? So at what level are they participating? What do the participants say about the support, right? So do they appreciate it? Do they have feedback? Is there anything to change? So those are the kind of questions that you would answer when you do a process evaluation. Collaboration: how well is the collaboration between the implementers working? How well is the collaboration with the district working? What works? You might even want to ask questions like, are there any other donors, any other implementers doing similar programs that you can link up with, right? So you can even go beyond this one program. Outcomes: did the program help with the curriculum recovery and addressing the backlogs? Obviously, you want to make sure that it's there. Did the program help prevent more losses? What were the other outcomes? Right, so we anticipate that, yes, this is focused on school functionality or school effectiveness, helping schools to address the learning backlogs, but in the process, there might be a range of other outcomes achieved. There might be really interesting materials developed. There might be really interesting sharing and learning that happens. So you want to be able to capture that kind of information. Now, the psychosocial impact, this really is up to the needs of the program, and you can include it, you do not necessarily include it. In one of the other evaluations I'm working with Kulisa on, they've decided to add a piece of psychosocial research on top of an existing evaluation. So you can ask, has COVID impacted educators' ability to teach and to the SMT's ability to lead? And if so, what does that look like? What kind of support is necessary? What has worked? What have you offered, and what is it that they really need? So those are kind of questions that you can ask around the psychosocial impact. Previously, we didn't really bother with this. So it's really interesting that this is a topic that's coming up more prominently in a number of programs that we are dealing with. And then the developmental evaluation. Does the design need to change? Are we doing the right thing? How do we respond to implementation issues and feedback? That basically means that the evaluation team sits into the program planning meetings with the implementers. We say, hang on, why are you doing that? Are you sure? Your contract says you're supposed to be delivering these outcomes. Why are you changing it? Yes, it's a good idea. Are you sure it's a good idea? So it's being that critical friend sitting at the table and asking these questions. If they suddenly say, well, I don't know, then the evaluator can come in and say, okay, why don't we develop a quick tool?
I think we've lost Benita again. One moment. Craig, can you just check if she's rejoining?
I'm just checking.
Thanks, Benita.
My side.
I'm sure she will come back on in a moment.
Sorry, I apologize. I have no idea why this is happening. Right, let's get back to, back to the screen. Okay, I've spoken about the developmental evaluation. Then in terms of outcomes, I think an outcome harvest approach might work quite nicely. And let me talk a little bit about that. So there's a really nice resource called Better Evaluation that has a lot of evaluation resources. If you need to plan an evaluation, manage an evaluation, do the analysis, communicate the analysis, it's got resources, nicely curated resources available. So if you don't know about Better Evaluation, do check out their website. And this is an example of how they explain outcome harvesting. So the approach is about harvesting evidence about what has changed, and then working backwards, trying to determine whether and how an intervention has contributed to these changes. So if you've got a really solid theory of change at the start, at the outset, you can do a normal outcome evaluation. You can do an impact evaluation. But if things are going to change along the way, you might want to have a little bit more flexibility. And the outcome harvesting approach allows you to do it. So the focus is primarily on outcomes rather than activities. It's usually very useful when the programming context is complex, and if your purpose is evaluation, right? So you want to track the change in the behaviors of the schools, the partners, the districts, etc. So that's when outcome harvesting is really appropriate. There are different steps when you do an outcome harvest, and I would like to encourage you to check out the resource on Better Evaluation. There's a whole outcome harvesting book that you can also read, but it's about designing the harvest where you try to figure out what are the kinds of things that you might be interested in measuring, who's going to use the evaluation results, what are the document sources. Then you review the document and draft some outcomes. If you've got a theory of change, that's a really useful place to start. Then you engage with informants to collect information, and you do as much as you possibly can to collect the data. But people will tell you, yes, my life has changed because of this program, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it was the program that caused it. So you really need to be very deliberate about substantiating the claims, verifying, cross-checking, triangulating the data, and asking the hard question about how did this program contribute? Analyze, interpret, and then deliver your report, your findings, your PowerPoint presentation, and support the use of the findings. So those are the steps in an outcome harvest. Interesting approach. It works really well if you've used outcome mapping as an approach for setting up your theory of change. And I really would like to encourage you to check this out. I think it's a very useful approach. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Benita. Let's open it up for some questions and comments, and in general, well, specifically in terms of the monitoring and evaluation support, but also just how all of this ties together and what people are thinking about it at this point. If anyone would like to raise their hand to speak and to contribute, please just use the little raise your hand icon in the right. If people want to post comments, that would also be good. Also just wondering if a couple of people that would like to respond, for example, if Henry or Ursula would like to respond to what's been said. Nick Taylor as well, if you'd like to come in on it. Any of our other evaluators that are also part of that are on the call. Just trying to see.
Hi, Margie. Yeah, so I thought it was just maybe just a comment on what he was saying regarding I think the flexibility, and I think the challenge of flexibility in the evaluation. And so this is something that we were really emphatic about in the design of the program up front, knowing that it was such a short-term project, knowing that we were operating in an environment of complexity, is to say, please allow us the flexibility, because we're going to go into an environment that we just don't know. There's so much uncertainty. And of course, that's I mean, you know, evaluators, your heads will explode when you don't know what it is that you're going to be finding. And I think that approach was really interesting. You know, the outcome harvest, but also the developmental evaluation. And I think this is something that's often missing from our evaluations that I've been involved in, where there is an opportunity to actually sit down and say, well, why are you doing this? Here's a tool that could help you understand better why you're doing it. So it's really encouraging to see that side of it, and the relationship between the implementing partners and the evaluators to be evolving in that way.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder that yes, the presentations are all put on the Bridge website for access, and there's also a summary that comes out from the discussions that is also put on there, and people can access previous M&E CoPs as well. So the one last year in terms of psychosocial support, for example, people are interested a bit more in theory of change, their resources on the Bridge website. Okay. I think there's one question, Benita, around what timeline would you use for M&E of the program?
Right, so with a one-year program, you want to get started as quickly as possible, right? So we had thought to start collecting the monitoring data like on a quarterly basis, do after the first quarter, after the first 3 months, do a very quick check around how are people reacting, how are people participating. So if we know that there's a problem with the implementation, we can quickly address that and help our partners to think that through. The developmental stuff would be right from the start, sitting in those meetings, helping people think through. Your outcomes, you will probably start looking at your outcomes towards the latter part of the year. You will start the outcome harvesting process earlier, but if you are interested in doing some case studies in schools, where you go and interview people, really go and look at their lesson plans, do a learner workbook analysis where you're going to count the number of pages of work that kids have done, looking at specifically the topics that they've been addressing. If it's an English program, how many pages of extended writing have they done? If you want to get a sense of how that is going, probably later in the year makes sense. But of course, if COVID closes the schools again, you've got a problem. And we do know generally, because we've done previous studies like this, that in a normal year, under normal circumstances, how much work would a school like these have completed by October or November in the year? So it depends, you know, you want to get started as quickly as possible. In terms of outcomes, you want to make sure that as much time has progressed before you start going to count whether the chickens have hatched. But it's about being part of the process along the way.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Ursula, for posting the link to your paper in the chat box and for sharing your email address as well. And I think it would be really interesting to hear a little bit more from people around the programs that they are implementing at the moment, and particularly just you know, how they are responding to it. I know, Naratsa, you've posted in the chat box around a program that you're involved in, and Makhali as well. It would be quite interesting to just hear a little bit about your programs and maybe any questions or approaches to monitoring and evaluation that you've got in there. Garth has posed a question for Ursula, interested on how the equation of loss of one school day equals loss of an additional day of learning was derived. In other words, on what evidence was the relationship ascertained? So Ursula, I wonder if you could respond to that. And then I see Jen from Kilisa has also got a question. So maybe after Ursula has responded, Jen, we can ask you. Ursula, are you?
Did you want me to come in? Sorry.
Please. I can see you also posting in the thing, but if you could respond, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, look, the calculations are quite difficult to make and quite complicated, and they're largely being done by economists. And like I said, they've changed over time. So, and a lot of them are based on the originally on the summer slide data from places like the US, but then they've also been a lot of studies, transition studies, for example, in more developing country contexts. And then there was a big Pakistani earthquake where they also measured learning losses. So a lot of the estimations are based on either on summer slide, so the big 3-month holiday in the US, and looking at how much learning is lost there and estimating, forgetting, etc. And then other estimations are based on sort of disaster situations where you, you know, like earthquakes or Katrina, the hurricane, and making estimations on based on those. So the COVID ones, a lot of the current estimations are extrapolations from those kinds of estimations. But if you look at the work of Martin Gustafsson here in South Africa, he's working a lot on that, and he was early on disputed the World Bank's estimation of one day learning loss, one day school day lost. And then Kaffenberger is also very good more internationally, who's looking at that. And then there was a question about the at-home. Yes, I do know about the Western Cape's at-home learning initiative. I think it's a really great initiative. It's taken quite a while to get print resources into homes to encourage learning, but that's happening now. And in particular, organizations like WordWorks are doing great stuff. But what the WCD did early on was they made printing budgets available to schools, and they did deliver printed material into schools during lockdowns. So yeah, I think they're doing great work. But I mean, I maintain that I don't think that the gravity of the loss has really been grasped. And we don't see any national, you know, the sense of a crisis that we need to do something about learning, reading in a way that hasn't been done before, because you know that's a year's worth, especially in those lower grades which didn't come back to school, where there's not a lot of print material available in the home. I don't really feel like that nettle's been grasped, and that there's been a concerted program or you know, strategy to deal with that.
Great, thank you. Ursula, there's another question for you around if you can comment on the effectiveness of the broad education support, the radio and television outreach programs in Kenya and Mexico, and
Yeah,
what we can learn from them.
Sure. So in the working paper, there are references to those programs. And I think what marked them out was firstly the fact that it was, you know, television and radio, so low tech, available to a wide sector of the population, but also that they were national programs with considerable national support. And I think what's happened with COVID here and elsewhere is we have a proliferation of lots of different online initiatives, and it's overwhelming, and it's in many cases unhelpful. So if you as a teacher go online to find resources, it's just there's too much. And even a program like the Was a Matric, which I thought was quite good, I'm not familiar with the one that Henry made reference to, they're incomplete. So you know, the key subjects that are just missing from that program. It's delivered, you know, really well, but with no translanguaging whatsoever, with no subtitles in different languages. So the whole language issue has not been grasped at all. So it's this incomplete, partial offerings and a proliferation of offerings. And I think what comes from the literature is simple things based on existing resources. So you're not starting from the beginning, and much more concerted effort behind them.
Thank you. I think that also raises the need for the diagnostics. So these baseline studies as part of a cycle of monitoring and evaluation, so that one's not only evaluating at the end, but one's actually going through a process to make sure from the design that it is integrated into the approach.
Yeah.
Okay, Jen, you had a question.
Thanks. So we've done a lot of evaluations in the education space, and one of the things I'm struck by is that the beneficiaries, the teachers, the principals, the district officials, often say to us, oh, it feels like the program's just getting going, that we've just finally achieved enough trust. And I'm interested in Benita and Ursula's and Henri's thoughts about program length. It seems to me that these programs are too short, and that they're stopped just when they possibly could be effective. Thanks.
Thank you. Ursula, would you like to come in, and then Benita?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that this is my area of expertise, but I completely concur if this is what Jennifer, I mean, that these programs, just as they're starting to show effect, get pulled. And so the sort of perhaps the best known South African example of that was the GPLMS, which was showing real promise and was then pulled. And a lot of it has to do with political, budgets and all kinds of things. Another program that I was involved in Uganda, also showing incredibly promising effects on early grade reading. And once the timeline of the project comes to end, it's ending. So absolutely, I think it is. I mean, I think it's a well-known challenge and something that also hasn't yet been addressed. But like I said, it's not really my area of expertise. I'm just aware of it as a real problem, that things take a long time to change. Schools, and in particular teachers' practices, take a very long time of sustained work to change, and project lifespans are generally too short to achieve that.
Benita?
I think Henry might be able to talk a little bit more about this, but I think if you've got an NGO that already has a footprint in a community, already has relationships with schools, already has relationships with the district officials, that helps a lot if you want to quickly onboard schools. onboarding always takes longer than anybody thinks. So if you want to run a one-year program in 2021, then you need to start planning it in July 2020 and start talking to people, right? So, and I think last year, July, everybody, surely, Hendrik, many of the projects that you were involved in had to stop because suddenly you can't get into schools and there's nobody to deliver the programs with. So the time necessary, yes, it's necessary, but there are ways in which you can find, where you can find some shortcuts.
Henry?
Yeah, just to pick up with Benita, I think that is, and that was part of our decision making in terms of where do we intervene. So this is working with an existing district that we already have really solid relationships with. So your startup phase is much quicker. That doesn't really sort of help. I agree with Jennifer. Absolutely, we need longer term interventions because we know, and as she said, teacher change really takes a significant amount of time. But I think what maybe the angle I would like to bring into this point is really around, again, the system level change. So I think this is where organizations like Xenix and the Xenix Foundation, looking at these kind of small, relatively small scale NGO run projects as pilots in a way, to test out methodologies, to bring in some of the evidence that we've seen in other areas and see if we can replicate this. And then ultimately try to infuse this into the system. Maybe, I mean, we know that system level change, really you have to do kind of small things consistently across the whole system. You don't have the luxury or the resources in a system level intervention to go in and send a coach into every school to support a teacher in the curriculum implementation. So you have to look at other aspects of your projects that you can really sort of build into the system level capacity. And I think that should become the priority as well. So in your project design, think of what am I doing here that could potentially be scaled? So we have to keep the scale conversation in the back. And I know that a lot of NGOs hate it because they say, oh, I work with 10 schools, I'm making a huge difference with these five teachers. And we hate to be asked about scale because we don't have the resources to think about scale. But if we can think about in the minutiae of it, when I'm doing this thing, can this little thing go to scale?
Thank you. And I think that's also a really important conversation that we need to bring into these bridge monitoring and evaluation CoPs is around scale. And what is it and how can we use the evidence and practice to really inform our understanding on what it is that we can actually take to scale. And part of it is also, as you're saying, is taking from the design and from the theory of change and from this evidence is around how do we disseminate it? How do we move it from a project or a short term into that more around that influencing that systemic change? And where do we want to take what we've learned from this project? How do we actually take that step in? Often the project is seen as an end date and that's been achieved, but it's really around how do we then move it into the deepening of the knowledge, the practice, the strategy, the policy going forward.
Yeah, if I could just say, so that's really, I think the last thing I spoke about was this initiative to try and bring a group of civil society stakeholders around education into conversation with provincial education department decision makers. And obviously that we're doing it at a provincial level because that's where we operate. But there obviously are opportunities to do it at national level as well. That's a big role that the NECT, for example, has to play, or that associations like NASCI, which is the Association for Social Change, or SAMIA, these kind of associations that bring together, we've got 84 people in the room today. That is incredibly potentially influential to be able to add your voice to a policy conversation. I think that's really, really critical. And imagine what you could do if you've got NASCI, NECT, SAMIA, and all these kind of associations who represent a brain trust of ideas and influence. We could certainly make a big difference.
Thank you. I think just before we move on to the final part of the of this CoP, is that there just two questions, one from Jenny and one from Chris, around sort of recommendations going forward in terms of putting programs in place at a South African level, dealing with these catch-up initiatives, but also around dealing with a deliberate focus on reducing inequalities. And sort of what advice, or what are the learnings, or what are the things that we need to do to take that next step, and as a group here. So opening it up once again for anyone to be able to respond, provide any input or guidance on that, and sort of what's emerged from this COP and from this discussion. The moment for anyone to think about that, and in terms of a response.
Just to speak, I think Jenny's question was about remote strategies, and I think I addressed that. But I mean, Chris's question really gets to the heart of it. I mean, this is our concern, and I mean it also is incredibly difficult to come up with strategies and policies, etc., in a context of such huge inequality, because it's difficult to it's difficult to target everyone, and yet it is also very seemingly politically difficult to differentiate. But what was also interesting for me in looking at the policies and the policy processes was firstly how often policies are developed not with the average school or teacher in mind, but rather are skewed towards more sort of middle class models or context of schooling. So for example, assumptions made around what teachers can do in relation to a trimmed curriculum, the assumptions made by a lot of provincial education departments about how many learners and teachers can access online learning. I mean, those were some key ones where you just thought, like, what on earth is this decision maker? Where are they sitting? Where was I going? Wait, there was something else I wanted to say. So that's the one thing. What did I want to say now? Hang on, totally lost my train of thought.
It does happen.
So I say on one hand, it's difficult to develop policy for this very unequal. Oh yes. The other thing is watching how the unions have responded to the DBE and to various decisions, and the ways in which they have really been incredibly at times disruptive on a curriculum level of decisions that might have alleviated the strain on schools. So for example, I'll give you an example, this idea of being able to suspend some of those subjects in the senior phase. That was it was a great decision. And the subjects that they chose were subjects that did not have this vertical dependency. So it was EMS, technology, subjects that if you took them away, it wouldn't matter so much the next year. There was a sense of like, this is a very full curriculum, let's open up some space. Completely obstructed by the union, so that it's back again. Similarly with life skills in the foundation phase. So, it's and the difficulty of returning to school at primary schools, so I think in some ways, although the union, I think, is there to represent and to support and particularly to look after the interests of teachers in schools, I think in some ways they're working to exacerbate some of these inequalities as well. So it's not just policy processes, but it's the ways in which policymakers are interacting and being held to account by the unions.
Great, thank you. Okay. I know there are a couple of other comments and questions in the chat box. Just conscious of time and that we are needing to move on to the last part of the COP. So I think that if people want to respond to any of those questions in the chat, please do so. But I'd like to move us and really pick up on what Honor was saying around the platforms for the communication and the dialogue and the discussions between the different stakeholders and role players. And looking at people who are participating in the seminar, I think we've got a fantastic mix between from researchers to evaluators to practitioners to from academics to education departments, NGOs and trusts that are part of this platform. And in the plannings for thinking about, where we come from over the last sort of 2 years in terms of the monitoring and evaluation COPs, and where do we want to go to, the team have given quite a lot of thought to how do we increase this collaboration and how do we really enhance and strengthen the educational evaluation skills and knowledge and understanding across the whole sector. And that's where we're really wanting to go back to the core principles of what this M&E CoP is about, and around how do we try and establish this type of, as Henry said, a brain trust, or this hub of our practice moving forward. So I want to ask Melissa King to come in here to really talk about and share with you some of the ideas of our new delivery model going forward, because we'd really like to get your input and your thoughts in terms of how do we take this and where do we take this forward, and how can we use this virtual platform maybe a bit more effectively or strategically or innovatively as the planned COP approach going forward, given that we are likely to only needing to continue to engage remotely over the next year. Please also just have your phones ready so that, because there is a Mentimeter activity as well. So Melissa, going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Margie. Sorry, everybody, to interrupt this interesting discussion that's been going on and to have to go into kind of more, logistical, practical things. But it is important. I think Margie's introduction has sort of picked up on this issue of a platform and what the COP is for. And I liked Henry's notion of a brain trust. And that is what COPs are supposed to be about. And we at Bridge have been a bit worried that we've been losing that focus with the increase in size. The move to online has meant that we have over 100 people sometimes on a COP. Is it still a COP? And that's what I'm going to talk about. And that's where the planning team was coming from. But before I go into all of that, we just wanted to get a sense of who is here in the sense of our old COPs pre-COVID, when we were meeting face to face. There were regular people who came all the time and we knew them, we could see them. Now, with last year in particular, we found that, especially with this particular COP, people came once off because they were interested in a topic and they weren't sort of necessarily community of practice members in a regular way. So Craig, can we do that first Mentimeter just to get a sense of how many people here are sort of first timers, or how many people here are regulars, or there's some various categories there, which we just wanted to get a sense of. So there are 4 questions there. If you can go onto Menti and answer those. The first time, whether you were a 2020 person, whether you were there 2019 and 2020, whether you're a long-termer, or whether you are a real Bridge fan who comes to more than just the M&E CoP.
And just a reminder, if people can look, if you look at the top of the screen, if you go onto www.menti.com, and then it'll ask you to put in the code. So put in 2457150, you'll get to the screen.
I've also put in a chat a direct link. So if you follow that link, you should get to the Menti poll as well.
Thanks, Craig.
How long do you think we need to give, Margie? Are some people still trying to get on there?
Yes, I think we've had 25 responses or so. We've got at least 80 people on this call and some people on Facebook that are also logging in. So let's just give it a few, another minute or so. As the responses come in, everyone can see the columns moving up and down. A couple of people are posting. I think if you haven't been able to get onto the Mentimeter, okay, let's give it a little bit. We've got about half the people on the call have responded so far. Okay, I think it's starting to slow down. It's a couple of people are saying they can't get onto the link. Just go into the www.menti.com and try. We'll leave it open for a little bit. Melissa, I think carry on.
Okay, well, that's quite interesting. So the split is between first timers and serious bridge CoP people who've been coming for a while. And then a couple, okay, so there was obviously more uptake in 2020 because the move to online actually meant that a lot more people could attend. So I guess that's not surprising that that's also quite a high number. Okay, so for some of the first timers, some of what I'm talking about will be new to you in terms of what COPs were for and the kind of progression of this particular monitoring and evaluation COP. But for many of the others, I think it'll be sort of familiar stuff, and we have talked about these kinds of things before. I'm going to do a quick presentation, and then we're going to talk about this sort of idea that we're going to experiment with. So Craig, thanks. If you can then put it onto the slideshow view, and then we can go for it. Okay, thanks, Craig. You can move. So yeah, renewing a commitment to core principles. So let me just, as a reminder, just talk a bit about the background and context. So Bridge has been running COPs since 2009, I think. I hope I've got that right. We had our 10-year anniversary a couple of years ago. And we've been on a long journey about communities of practice and what they are and the different forms, and are they one thing or have they developed into different things in different focus areas? Because for those of you who don't know, we run communities of practice in a whole lot of areas, ECD and teacher development and post-school access and various other sort of areas. And the COPs have gone across the years through different permutations. So our initial starting point was obviously Etienne Wenger's model, what are communities of practice? And this little slide is always a useful one. Communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or passion for something they do. That's the domain or the sort of interest area for which they have a concern or passion. And they learn how to do it better. That's the practice. The idea of a community of practice is that it is a learning space. It is a kind of a thing that builds up over time as they interact regularly. A community of practice is supposed to be a space where people come together and get to know each other and form relationships and interact regularly. So we've always taken that as our yardstick. Of course, there are other sort of bridge outcomes that we've had around building trust and building a community and co-creating and various other things, which have worked to greater or lesser degrees in different communities of practice and have changed as well over the years. So just to unpack that a bit, I'm not answering these questions. I'm just putting them up there and giving you a moment to think about them. So in terms of the domain, in relation to the M&E CoP, do participants have a shared interest in M&E? And are we all harnessing evaluative thinking in education work? That's what the CoP is for, to harness evaluative thinking. And that's our domain. And again, for the first time, people, I don't know who you are and why you're here. So, and there was quite a big group of you, but you can also think about these things, but particularly for those who've been attending last year and previously, think about these. What are we doing in these M&E CoP meetings? Are we learning about M&E, and or are we learning how to do it better? And a key question that we brought up last year, and when this community of practice was evaluated last year, was actually one of the main questions that the evaluators wanted to know. How much transfer to practice is there? It's all very well to come to the M&E CoP, but do people actually take what they have learned at the M&E CoP and actually apply it in their organizations? And just as a reminder, the outcomes of this M&E community of practice are to do with it being a learning space, and are to do with increasing capacity. And we had two sorts of sets of people coming. The one set were the professional M&E evaluators, and the other set are the implementers who actually get evaluated, but who need to understand their own organizations and who need to monitor and evaluate their own programs from within. So for those of you who remember when we used to meet at Chikalulu, when we were still face-to-face, we actually used to have those learning sessions, and there were cafe rotations, and a lot of it was to do, how do you apply monitoring and evaluation processes to actually understanding your own programs and your own organizations? And those were actually very fruitful discussions. So those are questions, again, which we're posing now as we progressed from the face-to-face through last year to the online space, through to this growth in numbers. And as I said, last year we did present on the evaluation results, and I know at least one of our evaluators is here because I've seen her name. And the key question was about this transfer to practice. Is it working? Is it achieving its objectives in terms of building capacity? Then the community issue. Are we a community? Do we interact regularly? One of the burning questions, because in some senses we are, as those who come regularly know, but the first timers and the people who sort of come, that's a key question. Okay, so Craig, could you go to the next one, please? Just to locate ourselves about the differences between webinars, workshops, and CoPs. And I mean, these are very slippery types of ideas, but I think we can talk to them. So webinars, we've all been to loads of webinars last year and this year, I'm sure. And very often they're standalone events. They're designed to be online. That's the whole purpose. And their key purpose is to present information on a topic by an expert. And the audience is whoever wants to come to that webinar. The invitations go out and whoever comes, as it were. So they're quite specific for a particular topic. Workshops, well, there are many kinds of workshops, and you can have a standalone workshop, or you can have a series of workshops that is for a very specific purpose and audience. And often it's to do with capacity building. And usually an expert or a trainer leads the workshop, and certain activities are done so people can learn. So people are working together on something in order to learn and apply new skills, or it might be a workshop to brainstorm ideas or to plan or to look at concepts and so on. Community practice meetings are supposed to be different from these two things. They are a thing. They happen at regular intervals. They're a process. They're not supposed to be once off. They're not supposed to be webinars. So you set up a community of practice in order to actually have a learning space that continues, often without a defined end date. There's a whole thing about the life cycle of communities of practice, which I won't get into now, but which is quite interesting. And Wenger also talks about that. They're set up for an identifiable and stable interest group who attend regularly. Whether these are experts or interested novices or practitioners on the ground or whatever, it's people who practice at some level in the area of domain, in the area of interest. All participants have some level of subject matter expertise and a common interest. And again, remember that this is generic. I'm not just talking about the M&E now. So the ECD community of practice, for example, is also multi-stakeholder, but everybody who comes works in ECD in one way or another. The key purpose speaks to the original bridge outcomes and the sort of high level outcomes, progressive building up of trust and shared understandings over time in order to spread good practice. So again, there's this idea of a learning space and a kind of consecutive building up. I forget the phrase that was used, I think in Ursula's presentation, about those subjects where you actually build on top of the complexities, like maths. You know, you can't just do it kind of in isolation. You've got to have previous learnings and previous knowledge. So those are just something that at Bridge we've been thinking about. What have we become? Have some of our online CoPs become webinars where people just come because they're interested in that topic, and that's that, and then they go and they listen and they then leave and whatever. So it's one of the, I suppose, concerns we've been having about the different CoPs and the different focus areas. Craig, can you just move on to the next one? So just to unpack that a bit more, and those of you who've been coming to other CoPs as well will recognize some of this. CoPs are action-driven and results-driven, and the activities include all of these things. And again, for people who've been coming to the M&E CoPs for a while, if you can just think about what does this CoP achieve and not achieve out of this list. Networking, well, we all know that it's actually easier to network when in the face-to-face thing, over the coffee and the tea and the before and after. And so networking, obviously, across all our CoPs has been a little bit diminished. Developing trust between members, forming partnerships, co-creating products and resources. I have to say this one was much more applicable to some of the other communities of practice, like the post-school access one and the ECD one, where you got little subgroups that went off and actually did things together and created tools and so on. It was never so much a thing that the M&E CoP did, even when we were smaller and face-to-face. Discussing and documenting ideas and innovations in the field. I think that one the M&E CoP has been very good at over the years. Identifying and solving problems. When we've taken a case study approach in the M&E CoP, we've certainly done some of those kinds of activities. Requesting and sharing information is something all CoPs have done. Planning and strategizing for joint activities. Again, some other Bridge CoPs have done more of that, especially the ECD, for example, which has engaged with policy and put in sort of advocacy documents and that kind of thing. Explaining and sharing tools, methodologies, and practices. The M&E CoP has been brilliant at that, and that's also very much thanks to our partnerships with Samia and Kalisa, who've shared tools and explained things and brought in the experts. So that's where the M&E CoP has been a fantastic learning space, I think. It's where I've learned a whole lot about M&E that I didn't know before. Mapping knowledge and identifying gaps. Identifying duplicated efforts. That happens very much more on a project where you get project sharings in some of the other CoPs, but I think could apply here as well. Growing confidence and competence. I think people who've come regularly, especially the implementers, not so much the professional M&E evaluators who already had the knowledge, but we had feedback from NGO implementers who have given us feedback that they've certainly learned a lot about M&E that they've applied in their own organizations. Responding to policy and other contextual developments. Very interesting, because today was the first time really I've heard policy mentioned so specifically really in relation to this particular community of practice. And now that we're actually looking at what the national policies around curriculum retrieval and learning losses, we haven't really responded to policy per se as an M&E CoP. Setting up working groups to take forward specific issues has been very particular to other Bridge CoPs. Providing learning opportunities, yes. and reflecting on own practice. I think that people have been doing that when we have structured the M&E CoPs. And again, that's been thanks to some of the masterclass things that we had through Kalisa and Samir, where we've actually structured activities where you could reflect on your own practice. So those are some of the things that CoPs should do. They're not things that webinars do, generally speaking, but we have done some of them in this M&E CoP. So some of these need to be grown and developed with a core group over time. Others can happen in any one session. Craig, can you just move on? And I'm nearly finished, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So in our own reflections, we've talked about this. This is just a little summary of the sorts of learning questions that we are asking ourselves about, are our communities of practice still communities of practice? Especially since with the online move, the numbers have increased hugely and the regular participation has changed a lot. People do come for once off and then don't come again, and all this kind of thing. Can we generalize about the kinds of outcomes we expect from our different CoPs? So those high level ones, which are to do with collaboration and product creation, which have happened in the past, where actually serious partnerships have emerged from communities of practice and big products have emerged. And that did not happen last year. Then the lower level outcomes, I think, is still there. Information sharing has been a major activity, and some of the learning space stuff, which is important, has also been a major activity. Another learning question, does size matter and does delivery method matter? We've had some closed CoPs where it's invitation only and you have much smaller groups, and we've had deep conceptual debates. These ones have been open CoPs and invitations get shared and anybody comes. And then the online face-to-face debate, there are key differences. And you may be familiar with the fact that we sent out a survey and there's a thought piece on our website about all these issues. And then what does it mean to be engaged in practice? So here we have multi-stakeholder, multi-perspectives and lots of people, whereas, for example, we had a closed community of practice initial teacher education, which only had teacher educators in it, university people. And very small, and it was closed. And there, obviously, it allowed for deeper engagement. Those are some of the sorts of questions Bridge is asking itself from the time when we moved online and all these changes have happened. So the planning team for the M&E CoP has obviously also been considering some of these questions. And Craig, can you move to the next slide? So we've been concerned as to whether the kind of learning agenda and learning space where we, especially in 2018 and 2019, we actually developed a sort of thematic type of program for the year where we built on things, and we had those terminology sharings, and we had those sorts of things where one CoP followed another, and it was actually much more useful if you'd been to the previous CoP when you came to the next one, because we built on some of those learnings. And last year that couldn't really happen because of the size, and because we very soon began to realize that we were getting people who came who just had an interest in that particular one. So we thought, is there a way of trying to get back to our original core values? And we thought about this dualistic hybrid type of model. Mel here refers to monitoring, evaluation and learning hub. We still don't know what to call that in a group and whether this would work, but we want to experiment with it. So we would have a sort of a two-level type of event where you'd have this inner group, the monitoring, evaluation and learning hub, invited participants, targeted participants, almost like a closed CoP. Members commit to regular attendance. I've put X there because we don't know. If we do it this year, it'll be the next 3 CoPs. And these would be people who really want to engage. Now, whether they are professional evaluators or whether they are the NGO implementers who have an interest in learning more, or who are having to engage in their own internal evaluations, or whoever it is. we would do some pre-briefing before the COP to prepare for some kind of interactive engagement. And this inner group would serve as almost like a panel, a discussion debate panel at the COP meetings. And because of their commitment to regularity, some of that networking and building trust and relationships through the COP may come back. This would not mean that this outer group can't participate anymore. So the wider invitation would still be there, but it would be the open participation. So the people who want to come, the irregular attendees who've been coming for information gathering and for learning, could still ask questions in the chat, could pose questions, and maybe there'd be a pause at a certain point, but there would be almost like a sort of a fishbowl type of scenario where the inner COP is interacting and trying getting into this deeper conceptual debate, and the outer core can listen and be more like webinar participants. That's the idea that we've been floating. We're still looking into the platform and how we would do this and whether it would work. But we thought, let's use the first COP of this year to get some response to this idea. So there's the proposal, there's the idea. The other members of the planning team, which is Margie, Benita, and Benta, and Niratso, please feel free to pull in as well and add in here. Let me just, Craig, go to the next slide. So yes, so the next bit of this will be, if the team wants to add into anything I missed out or didn't explain properly, your questions and responses, and we're going to have a little Mentimeter survey on there. And I've just put that read more on the Bridge website, because currently on the Bridge website, there is a thing called Changing Perspectives on COPs, which explores all of this in reference to the survey we did last year and goes into some of those learning questions more deeply. So we can stop sharing now. And thanks, Craig. And then I don't know if the M&E planning team wants to add in anything there before we put the next Mentimeter questions up to get your Mentimeter responses, and then we open up for a little bit of discussion. Margie, do you want to take back over there?
Thanks, Melissa. I can't see any hands at the moment directly in terms of relation to this, so, or input. So my suggestion is that we go on to we share the Mentimeter straight away. I think that would be good. I think there's some good comments that are coming through around people who've always found at least, you know, one tip or idea to take away from each of the COPs they've attended for use in programs. People have loved the sessions. People would like to share a little bit more about, you know, about what they've learned and the experience in the field as well, which I think is really nice. Suggestion around
Margie, can I respond to the breakout rooms one just very quickly, because we have done that and it did work where we had very structured activities. I'm thinking of the masterclass, for example, that Letitia gave, but sometimes it's a bit problematic to facilitate when you've got large numbers of people. And also, as a comment, when we used to do group work in face-to-face, we were just getting to the point where we realized we had to be much more intentional about who we put with who, because people would sit at tables where they knew each other, and you'd get all the professional evaluators sitting at one table, and you'd get all the newcomers sitting at another table, and you'd get all the implementers who knew each other sitting at another table. So you didn't get that exchange of different types of experience. And we were just moving towards the idea of actually planning the group work where we identify people into groups. And then COVID hit. And it's quite hard to do that in the breakaway rooms in a way that will actually be fruitful. We tried the networking thing, putting people in there before and after, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So thank you for noting that. And we have used the breakaway rooms, and I could go on forever about the pros and cons of breakaway rooms, but I'll stop. Thanks.
Melissa, maybe you can also, or Benta could also respond around creating provincial COPs.
I think Benta, you take that one.
So we have a Western Cape CoP because we have the capacity there. We have a group that's interested in running that CoP, and they are sort of, on their own journey, and their agenda is slightly different from the national CoP. For the other provinces, I would say we don't really have, capacity. It's an issue of capacity, we are happy to have, people from other CoPs joining this CoP and, also sharing and learning, what we have to share. So at this stage, I think we will only be continuing with our Western Cape CoP, and we actually have one CoP next week, Wednesday the 10th. If you're interested, let me know and we can share the details of that with you. But for now, we are sticking to the Western Cape and then the national one, just because of capacity.
Great, thank you. It's a question around Sameer's view on this approach. Benita, as our Sameer representative, do you want to jump in here?
Yes. So the difference between the Bridge Monitoring and Evaluation CoP and the Sameer constituency is that Sameer is for evaluation, general hanger honors. So you don't need to be an evaluator, but you need to be interested in evaluation, and it's much broader than just education, right? So it's a very specific constituency. The Bridge M&E CoP are people that are interested in monitoring and evaluation and education, and it's a blend of people. It's less just the evaluation people, it's a broader group of people. So there's definite overlaps. And actually, you'll see Sameer will be putting out, just put out a notice yesterday saying this year there will not be a conference. Usually Sameer does conferences, but they've also recognized the need for more collaboration around specific programs. So they are going to develop a co-creation event. More details will follow. But yes, I think there's very big overlap. There's a very big appetite for sharing between the two organizations and the two constituencies.
Benita, do you want to just jump in with anything else around sharing updates on Sameer as we're talking about it, and then we'll come back to the Mentimeter? Yes,
so maybe if I can just, you might know about Sameer, but if you do not, Sameer is the South African Monitoring and Evaluation Association. And like I said, that they are for people interested in evaluation. So it might be practitioners, it might be academics, it might be implementers. So it's for everybody interested in evaluation. The network, we've been going since, goodness, 2006. That's when Sameer was founded. Jennifer Biscard and a couple of us founded Sameer actually back then. And you can become a Sameer member by joining, go to the website sameer.org.za. You can join up as a member. There's member-only benefits, but there's also an open listserv where you can access job opportunities, consultancy opportunities, information about trainings. Usually there's a discount for participants, for members of Sameer in the Sameer events. And it's a good place for people to get to know each other. So we've also got a Twitter handle, sameer.za. So you can follow Sameer on Twitter. And then, like I mentioned, we've got some plans. There won't be a conference this year, but we'll do something better than a conference. It's difficult given COVID and our concerns about COVID and the disruption and the safety issues. So there will probably be some kind of a co-creation event. The board is working really hard on putting together some proposals around this. It might be a hackathon where you develop a toolkit. It might be something like a capacity building where people, more of a workshop kind of approach. So the details about what will emerge is not clear at the moment, but keep in touch on the Sameer listserv. Please keep in touch on the Sameer Twitter handle, and we'll share more information there. So the details are at the bottom of the screen if you wanted to pursue it.
Great, thanks, Benita. I think it's really important to just understand what the different roles are and the focus areas. So understanding that, we can now come back to looking at the M&E CoP in particular. Craig, I think that if you could share the Mentimeter on the screen. I know we are rapidly running out of time and a number of people are having to step up. Maybe if you can just mute that person, thank you. Okay, so let's quickly get some input from everyone. Should be on the same Mentimeter handle or code. Let's just, oops, one moment while try again to share that screen.
I seem to have entered my computer. It is a different code.
Oh, it's a different code, sure.
So I have put it up. I'm going to start sharing because it seems to have come back. Apologies. Share. There we go. People should be able to see it. And you can see that the new code is at the top.
Okay, we're getting some responses coming through. Thank you, everyone.
And Margie, there are 3 questions in this poll. So just to bear that in mind, when people have, we reached sort of a critical mass, we just let me know when to move on.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, maybe we can just scroll down a little bit on the screen to see the new answers that are coming in. There is a mix between yes and no and not reallys. So I think after this, we'll put it together and sort of quantify it a little bit to get a sense overall what people's approaches are and the reasons. Thank you, everyone, for giving input. We've had on to about 20 people who've responded.
Apologies, Margie. I'm really struggling with getting it to do what I wanted to do.
It's okay, it does.
And let people see, but at the moment it just seems to be fighting against me. We will obviously have all of these responses in the knowledge product. We will add it as an addendum so people will be able to see the various responses. But again, apologies.
No problem. It does happen. We've all experienced that with these online and technology that suddenly does give us some challenges. Okay, I've got sort of 24 responses. They seem to be up. There we are. Well done. Okay, once again, very mixed responses.
And it's interesting, Margie, that it's actually echoing, you know, we sent out a survey, I think the middle of last year, about raising these same questions about online versus face-to-face and numbers and open and closed. And it was the same kind of issues. There were quite extreme views on either end of the spectrum and some unsure and, you know, quite a kind of split responses.
I think it does also show that, you know, with this change in practice, I think we're all learning and growing and understanding. We've all got preferences. And part of it is, you know, the process of this change and this engagement. And I think it's also useful to document these experiences that we are going through over time. And we can look back in a year's time or 2 years' time and see, you know, where have we come from and how have we grown and developed over time. Okay, great, thank you. I think we've got about 30 responses. So I think maybe we should move on to the next one. Great. Once again, the same link in the chat. Just a reminder that these are anonymous, so we are not tracking who said what, no repercussions, all very clear and following data confidentiality and privacy of responses. Okay, so some important questions, and questions that we're also grappling with around making sure it doesn't come clicky, or deciding who's in the inner group, the importance of not losing the broad sharing platform, but liking the idea of the fishbowl and sort of the intensive discussions in there. People who want to be in or out of the ring. I think most people would like to be in the ring. Okay, yep, there is the reality of people's commitment around other work priorities, so need to consider that. We also are aware that in a number of cases, people from the same organization attend and participate in the different CoPs, and then they share that and the experience and the inputs amongst them, amongst their organization. I think it can work. People wanting to dip in and out of it. Yep, would be the commitment again around sort of a couple of core people to be able to do it. Is commitments. Okay, we've had about 20 odd responses coming through. Okay, we do want to still keep the sharing of knowledge, and engagement is really important. I think it is really around how do we maintain the inclusiveness of people, and that I think the monitoring and evaluation in the education sector is still a critical aspect of the development of programs and responses around the using the knowledge and the data that does emerge, how that does link to practice and strategies, organizational strengthening, the policy part of it. Okay, connectivity, which is still an issue, and looking at that, and so yes, looking at different modes of how to address that, and I think that is really a focus and something that as a country and across our programs and the areas that we work in, that is really going to come to the fore this year. I think we're going to see some huge developments in the way that we do connect and use modes, how to keep it simple. I think that was a really important point that is coming out from what Ursula was sharing and from the evaluations. Great, thank you everyone. I think about 24 responses so far. I think this is the last one, if I've been counting correctly.
Yes, it is.
Great. So this is around the core group, and I know some people did respond to this in the previous one around if people would be willing to be part of it. We wanted to just get a sense from everyone around the numbers to be able to, yeah, get a sense around selections. I think if people do have some other ideas around, you know, how one would decide on who's part of it, or sort of key criteria, taking more of an evaluative approach to it, of, you know, what would the core purpose or criteria be for participation in this core group, do post that in the chat box as well. Okay, we're getting some responses. We've got about 60 people still on this Zoom, and I think a couple still on Facebook. Thanks also to people who are posting in the chat box around them wanting to be part of it. Any the final inputs. Okay. I think there's it's starting to tail off, the responses. So thank you very much, everyone. I think there is real commitment from people as illustrated here. I think there's also a lot of very honest sort of responses in terms of time commitments. So thank you also for that. It is a key consideration that we would need to take into account. So I think on that note, Craig, if you could stop sharing. Melissa, any sort of final words and input from your side regarding this?
Just to say that, you know, this is still a kind of a idea in embryo, and the Bridge team and our partners maybe need to think a little bit more about it and how it would work. But I think, Bente, we have thought we would send out some kind of communication after this COP to everybody and well, to our member database, as it were, and actually see what the response would be and the interest would be. And I think the big issue is the time commitment, but obviously if people really couldn't come, you know, they wouldn't be kicked out forever, as it were, you know, and that we need to emphasize that if you're part of the wider group as well, you know, one can still have an opportunity to make comments and pose questions. So we'll send something out after the COP, and people who are interested can then respond directly to us, and we'll take it from there. I don't know, Bente or any of the rest of the team, if you want to add anything.
I think that's it. We'll communicate further. We'll send out an email to everybody who participated today and see how to take it forward.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bente and Melissa, for the way forward on that. So I think on that note, we're coming to the end of the first M&E CoP for the year. I think a huge thank you to everyone who did present and to engage. I think it was really, really interesting, and I think that it's very thought-provoking, and also on our way forward in terms of both addressing learning losses, but also what that means for our monitoring and evaluation practice. Thank you very much for all the comments and the questions, and everyone for participating, listening, engaging, staying on the call. We're really looking forward to the rest of the COPs going forward, and thank you for all the inputs on these ideas. I think you've given us quite a lot to consider further. And as Bente said, there'll be further communication regarding them, but a huge thank you to everyone. And everyone, please keep safe, keep well, and carry on, as they say. Huge thanks to everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margie. Thanks, everybody.